When a woman walks into the fire with nothing but 3 children and a wedding blanket, you don't ask where she came from. You ask what the hell happened to make her keep going. This is Nita's story, and it don't start pretty. Part 1. The cast out word count, 790 tone, gritty, cinematic, emotional, frontier real style, Wild West, classic American Western storytelling. The sun in 1879. Colorado didn't shine, it punished. The wind didn't cool, it peeled skin, and the red dirt underfoot wasn't soil, it was judgment, packed tight with every boot that ever walked over someone like her. Nita Hawk kept walking. She had no husband, no home, no help. Just 3 boys behind her. Levi, 8, walking like he was older than he should be. Jesse, 6, who hadn't spoken since yesterday. And little Wade, barely 4, shuffling with open blisters on both feet. She had no food, just the memory of it. No shelter, just sky. All she carried was a canvas sack. Inside, a tin cup, 2 sewing needles, and the wedding blanket that had once wrapped her baby boy on his first night home. Now it smelled like ash and sunburn. She'd been cast out 7 days ago. Her late husband's sister had delivered the sentence. Ain't no room for no Apache under this roof. Then the farmhouse door slammed, a sound louder than any gunshot Nita had ever heard. It still echoed in her ribs every time the wind shifted. She didn't argue, didn't beg, just took the boys and started walking. A hawk floated above, carving slow loops across the sky. Nita squinted up at it, sun in her eyes. Free, she thought. That's what it means to fly. Mama, Levi's voice cracked like old wood. Where we going? She didn't look down, didn't slow. Someplace better, she answered. It was a lie, but she said it like gospel, because that's what mothers do. They keep lying until hope believes, and the trail shimmered ahead, more heat than land. She could barely tell where the sky ended and the earth began. Just a blur of sagebrush and sunstroke. To white folks, she was too Apache. To the Apache, too white. She belonged nowhere. The in-between had no porch, no welcome, and no forgiveness. Still she walked. By the time Willow Creek came into view, the sun was bleeding out, and the wind tasted like copper. The town didn't rise from the land. It clung to it, desperate and mean. She led the boys down the center of Main Street. Their boots made hollow sounds on the boards, too loud, too out of place. A few men in suspenders paused their whittling and watched. A woman gripped her child's hand tighter. Another crossed the street entirely. Nita didn't flinch. They passed the general store. She looked inside. Barrels, flour, coffee, work maybe? The shopkeeper glanced up. One look and that was enough. He didn't speak, didn't scowl, just looked through her, like she wasn't worth seeing. Wade tugged her skirt. Mama, I'm hungry. I know, baby, she said, brushing dust from his cheek. Just sit a spell. She lowered herself onto the mercantile steps, gathering them close. The wood was hot from the day's heat. The wind tugged at her braid, lifting the frayed edges of her skirt. A group of ranch hands passed. One spat at the dirt. Squaw, he muttered, not bothering to whisper. She kept her head high. That was all she had left. The sky turned copper, then bruised purple. Night was coming, and with it, cold, hunger, coyotes. She reached under her blouse, fingers finding the smooth cross on a worn chain, her husband's parting gift. She didn't pray, she just held it. Then, the sound of hoofbeats, slow, steady, certain, out of the red dusk came a man on horseback, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. The kind of man who didn't hurry for anyone. Nita didn't move. He reined in by the steps, looked down at her. His eyes were dark and kind in a way most men forgot how to be. Looks like you've run clean out a road, ma'am, he said. She nodded once. Just resting. He looked past her to the boys. No pity, just recognition. Name's Silas Croft. I run Circle B Ranch, 6 miles west. Storm's coming fast. Got a cabin, dry roof, warm stove. She didn't answer. He didn't. Push. No charge, he added. Ain't charity either, just decent. She hesitated, then reached for his hand. The first fat raindrop hit the ground between them, and just like that, her life took a turn. Call to action. Cinematic, emotional, Western. If that moment got under your skin, don't ride off just yet. Nita's journey is only beginning, and what waits at Circle B might just change everything. Subscribe now, and stay for the storm. By the time the wagon rattled out of Willow Creek, the sun had vanished, and the wind smelled like trouble. But Nita had no wagon, no horse, no ride, just her sons and her silence, and a town that had already measured her and found her unworthy. Willow Creek had promise. From a distance, it looked like a place a woman could start over. Up close, it was vinegar in a whiskey bottle. Pretty label, nothing sweet inside. Her boots scuffed the warped planks of Main Street. The storefront windows reflected back 4 ghosts, her and her boys, dusty, thin, and unwanted. The town didn't say it outright. It didn't have to. It said it with closed shutters and turned backs. It said it with the way women gripped their children tighter, the way men chewed slower when she passed. It said it with silence so sharp it cut. Levi walked ahead, jaw clenched like a man twice his age. Jessie kept close to her hip, head down. Wade dragged behind, too tired to complain. Their shadows stretched long across the boardwalk, fading with the last light of day. She stopped outside the Mercantile. Her stomach twisted at the smell of flour, leather, and salt pork wafting through the cracks in the door. She peered through the glass. Inside, the shopkeep was counting coins. Big man, red face, beard like rust. He looked up and locked eyes with her through the window. And then, nothing. Not a nod. Not a word. Not even a twitch of his lip. Just that. Look. The one that saw her and dismissed her in the same breath. She turned away. Across the street, a dog barked. A woman in a sky-blue dress whispered something to her husband and cast a look that curled like smoke. Sharp, fast, and full of judgment. Nita lowered herself onto the steps of the general store. The wood was warm beneath her skirt, but the air had teeth. She pulled her boys close. Levi sat stiff. Jessie leaned in without a word, and Wade curled against her side like a pup in need of shelter. A group of ranch hands ambled past, boots loud, on the boards laughter louder. One of them, a lean man with a mustache like he glued it on wrong, slowed down just enough. Well now, look at this picture, he drawled. Half-breed picnic on the porch. The others chuckled, then quieted when they caught Levi's hard stare. Best keep movin', Nita said flatly, voice dry as mesquite. She didn't look up. The man smirked but moved on. They always moved on. Pride was the last thing she owned. And she wore it like a bulletproof vest, even if it didn't stop much. She wrapped an arm around each boy and watched the sky darken to iron. No one was coming. No one was going to offer food, or work, or even water. The town had closed its doors, to her before she even knocked. Wade whimpered. I'm cold, he said, voice barely a whisper. I know, baby, she replied, brushing his curls back. We'll find a place. But where? The livery? The church? Or out under the eaves like strays? She looked down the street. Dust blew in little devils through the alleyways. A shutter slammed somewhere, and it sounded too much like that farmhouse, door back in Arkansas. The one that sent her out into the world without anything but her boys and her bones. She pulled the wedding blanket from the sack and draped it over the boys. That blanket had once meant home. Now it just meant they were still trying. Above them, the sky cracked, dry thunder rolling over empty land. Mama, Jessie whispered, they don't like us here, do they? She didn't lie. No, baby, they don't. He nodded like he already knew. Levi held still, staring out at the dirt road like he was waiting for something to come out of it. And then, a sound. Low, steady, hoofbeats. Nita squinted through the dust. A rider emerged from the blur, framed by the last orange bleeding from the sky. She knew, without knowing how, that he wouldn't ride past, and he didn't. He stopped in front of them, said nothing at first, just looked. A long, solid silence. Not the kind that judges. The kind that sees. His name was Silas Croft. And when he spoke, it wasn't with pity. It was with quiet recognition, like he'd seen a storm just like her once and hadn't turned away. The wind died for just a second, long enough for Nita to hear the horse's breath, thick, steady, and warm. The rider didn't speak right away. He just sat tall in the saddle, reins loose in one hand, the other resting on the horn like he wasn't in any kind of hurry. Dust swirled around his boots. The light behind him was bleeding into rust. His figure cut clean against the sky. Dark hat, trail-worn coat, and a jaw that looked like it had made peace with silence. Nita stayed still. The boys pressed closer. Her instincts screamed to move, to protect, to brace for the kind of man who smiles first and hurts later. She'd met too many of those. But he wasn't smiling. He looked at her like a man who's seen pain before, and hadn't forgotten how to recognize it. "You look like you're out of road," he finally said, his voice low and quiet like dusk itself. Nita didn't answer. "We're just resting," she said instead, voice firm but fraying. The man nodded once. No judgment, no challenge, just acknowledgement. "I'm Silas Croft," he said, tipping his hat a fraction. "I run the Circle B west of here." He glanced skyward. Clouds were rolling down off the mountains like bruises stretching across the horizon. Storms about to blow. "Got an empty line cabin with a roof that don't leak and a stove that still kicks heat." She narrowed her eyes. "Men don't offer shelter for nothing. Not to women like her. I don't need charity." "Good," he said, not missing a beat. "Ain't offering it." Silas dismounted in one fluid motion. He moved like he'd been on the trail all day but had enough strength left to carry a man if needed. He didn't get too close, just stood a few paces away, giving her space like it was something he understood was earned. Cabin's got 4 bunks. Windows cracked, but the door lock's solid. You and your boys are welcome for the night. Still, Nita didn't move. "You don't know us," she said. Silas shrugged. "I know the look of someone who's held it together one day longer than they thought they could." His words cut clean. She looked down at Levi, Jesse, and Wade, tucked beneath the faded wedding blanket like roots clinging to dry soil. "You got children," he added, softer. "And a storm coming. This ain't the night to be proud." It wasn't pride she felt. It was exhaustion laced with memory. But she nodded once. Silas reached out his hand, gloved, steady and unhurried. For a heartbeat she just stared at it, then she took it, and in that small act something shifted, not just in her bones, but in the air around her. Like the storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was moving past her. "Let's get y'all out of this mess," Silas said, his tone still gentle but already in motion. He helped the boys into the buckboard hitch behind his horse. The seat was worn, the blanket across it thin but dry. Nita climbed up last, her eyes never leaving him as he settled into the saddle and turned west, toward the mountains, and whatever waited beyond them. The ride was quiet. The wind picked up behind them, pushing them forward like a shove from God himself. Lightning flickered along the ridge, and the scent of wet sage crept through the air. The boys fell asleep leaning on each other, their heads bobbing with every rut and sway. Nita sat stiff, every bump jarring her deeper into awareness. Silas didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't ask. He just led, and that, more than anything, eased the tight coil in her chest. By the time the fence line of the Circle B appeared through the rain-soaked twilight, the first drops had turned to a steady curtain. The ranch looked like something out of another. Life, lamplight glowing in the windows, smoke curling from a chimney, fence posts standing like soldiers in the mist. They stopped in front of a small cabin on the edge of the main yard. No one else around, just the sound of the storm crawling over the hills. Silas dismounted and handed her the key. Firewood's inside, stew on the stove if Hattie Mae remembered to leave it. Then, as if it was nothing at all, he tipped his hat and rode off into the dark, vanishing into the rain like he'd never been there. Nita opened the cabin door. Warmth hit her like a memory she didn't think she'd ever feel again. Wood smoke, stew, the sound of something real and safe. She pulled the boys inside. Wade murmured in his sleep. Levi opened one eye, confused but calm. Jesse stumbled toward the fire like it was calling his name. She shut the door behind them, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, Nita Hawk didn't feel hunted by the world. She felt still, not safe. Not yet, but still. And sometimes, out in the wild, that was the first miracle. The storm broke like a war drum overhead. Rain came down in sheets, slapping the porch, thundering on the roof, hammering the dry dirt into mud. Inside the line cabin, the fire popped and hissed as cold air chased in behind Nita and her boys. She shut the door fast and leaned against it, breathing hard, not from running, but from finally stopping. The cabin was small, one room, 4 bunks, a stove still warm from a recent fire, and a stew pot on the hob that smelled like beef, onion, and mercy. The window rattled. Lightning flashed across the hills. Jesse clung to her side like he'd melt into her bones. Levi helped Wade onto the nearest cot, then climbed up beside him without being asked. The 3 of them huddled like a litter of pups, wrapped in the wedding blanket still damp from the ride. Nita moved slow. Her muscles ached from too many miles, her feet raw, her spirit frayed. She didn't trust the warmth yet, didn't trust the roof to hold, didn't trust the man who'd left them here without asking for anything in return. But she trusted the fire. She trusted the food. She ladled stew into tin bowls stacked on the shelf. It was still hot, rich, and thick. Someone had made it with care. She handed the bowls to the boys and sat beside them, watching as they devoured it with quiet urgency. Wade giggled through his 3rd bite. Levi let out a breath like he'd been holding it for days. Jesse just closed his eyes between spoonfuls like he was remembering how to be alive. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills like a tired god. Inside, for the first time in weeks, there was stillness. Not silence. Stillness. Nita let herself sit, back just for a second. Her eyes drifted to the fire, and something inside her, tight and tired, unclenched. The cabin door creaked open without warning. She shot to her feet, already standing in front of her sons. A woman stood there dripping, wet, wrapped in a shawl and holding a tin lantern. She wasn't young, gray braided into her dark hair, shoulders square, eyes sharp as a branding iron. "Name's Hattie Mae," she said flatly. "I do the cookin' and the talkin' at Circle B." Her gaze landed on the boys, then back on. "Nita, you got names?" Nita hesitated. "I'm Nita. These are Levi, Jesse, and Wade." Hattie Mae nodded once, not soft but not cold. She stepped in, set the lantern down, and pulled a towel from her basket. "Children don't need to be sleeping in wet clothes," she said. She handed Nita the towel, then rummaged around and pulled out a stack of clean flannel nightshirts, worn, patched but dry. Nita took them with shaking hands. "I don't take charity." Hattie's eyes met hers and narrowed. "I didn't say you did. I said your boys don't need pneumonia." Then she turned and walked out into the rain without another word. Nita stood still for a long beat. The towel in her hand smelled faintly of cedar and soap. She dressed the boys slow and quiet. Wade yawned like a baby raccoon and curled up with a full belly. Jesse tugged the blanket over all 3 of them without speaking. Levi gave her a look before he closed his eyes. A look that said thank you, and don't leave all at once. She sat by the stove after they slept, her feet near the coals. Steam rose from the hem of her skirt. Her mind drifted to Silas Croft. Why had he helped her? Men didn't do that. Not for women like her. Not without asking for something in return. But he hadn't lingered, hadn't looked twice. Just handed her a key and rode off into a storm. She reached into her blouse and pulled out the silver cross her husband had given her the week they married. It was warm from her skin, smooth with years of touch. She held, like a memory, not a prayer. Not yet. The wind howled. The stove clicked. The storm didn't let up, but it stayed outside. And in that one-room cabin, Nita Hawk breathed deep for the first time since Arkansas. She didn't know what tomorrow held. Didn't know if the Circle B was a resting place or a trick of fate, but she knew this much. Tonight, her boys were fed. They were dry. And they were asleep. And for a woman who'd been cast out by her blood and ignored by her country, that was more than a gift. It was survival. Nita was up before the rooster. The prairie, outside, was still dark, the kind of black that swallowed noise and memory. The storm had passed, but the chill had teeth. Inside the cabin, her boys slept in a tangle of quilts and childhood dreams. She left a kiss on each forehead, then stepped into the cold. She didn't wake Hattie Mae. She didn't knock. She went straight to the pump, rolled up her sleeves, and drew water with a rhythm that matched the beat of her pulse. Strong, stubborn, steady. By sunrise, she'd hauled 2 buckets, chopped kindling, and started a fire in the cook stove. That's when Hattie Mae found her, elbow deep in flour, sweat streaking her brow, mixing biscuits like she'd been born to do it. "You trying to take my job?" Hattie said, arms crossed. Nita didn't stop kneading. "I don't take charity," she said without looking up. "If we're staying, we're earning it." The old woman let that hang in the air. For a long moment, nothing moved but the fire. Then Hattie gave a single nod, like she'd been waiting to hear those words. "Good. There's a dozen mouths to feed come supper." Nita worked that whole day with the quiet fury of someone who refused to be pitied. She swept the bunkhouse, floors, carried sacks of oats, patched shirts with stitches so neat you'd think they were machine done. When Silas rode in from the upper pasture, she was hanging wet linens on the line with the boys chasing chickens nearby, weighed in stitches at Jesse's poor herding technique. Silas slowed his horse and watched, a strange tightness tugging at his chest. He'd brought in drifters before, fed folks who never looked him in the eye. But Nita, she met the world with her spine straight, even when the world spit her out. And those boys of hers? They didn't whimper. They didn't steal. They laughed like they'd found something worth holding on to. After supper, the hands sat around the fire drinking coffee. Nita didn't join them. She stayed back, mending a split seam on Levi's pants. Her fingers moved fast, but her eyes were always scanning, always calculating. She hadn't relaxed, yet. Not really. But then something shifted. Jed, the oldest ranch hand, let Jesse climb onto his knee and showed him how to whittle a stick into a horse. Wade fell asleep, curled next to the hound dog like he'd always lived here. And Levi? He helped Hattie Mae dry the dishes, asking her questions about cow branding and sourdough starters. The Circle B, which once echoed with nothing but boots and silence, was starting to sound like a home. Later that night, as she swept the porch in the moonlight, Silas leaned against the rail. "You've worked harder than any hand I've paid this month," he said. She kept sweeping. "Then you ought to be paying me." He smiled at that. "Maybe I should." Nita stopped, broom in hand, and looked at him. Really looked. "You don't owe me," she said, "but I won't be pitied either." Silas shook his head. "Ain't pity. It's respect." She let the words sink in. They landed deeper than she expected. He tipped his hat, just a touch, and walked back inside. Nita stood there a while longer, staring out at the open dark. The prairie was still wild, still dangerous, but in that moment, standing on someone else's porch with calluses on her hands and her sons safe in their beds, she realized something rare. She wasn't surviving. She was beginning to live. The heat of summer settled over the Circle B like a wool blanket. Long days bled into longer evenings, the air thick with dust and honeysuckle. Work was hard, but steady. And life was starting to carry a rhythm. Nita had found a place in it, not just in the chores and cooking, but in the heartbeat of the ranch itself. The boys ran wild and sun-browned, roping fence posts and falling asleep before the stars even came out. And Silas, he'd begun teaching them more than ranch work. He taught them how to ride straight and shoot true, how to patch leather and talk low around skittish horses. He spoke to them like little men, and in turn, they looked at him like he was something just shy of legend, Nita noticed. One night after the supper dishes had been stacked and the lanterns lit, she stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooler there, the kind that hummed with quiet things, the chirr of crickets, the creak of wood settling, the breath of the prairie. Silas was already sitting there, nursing a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. He didn't speak when she sat, just rocked slowly in his chair and let the silence stretch wide. Finally, he said, "Boys are taken to the land." Nita nodded. They never had a chance to be boys before? Not really. He turned to her, eyes soft under the brim of his hat. "What about you?" She looked out into the darkness. "I don't reckon I ever had a chance to be anything before." Silas let the words settle. Then he asked, low and careful, "Where'd you come from, Nita?" She stiffened just a touch. Old instincts rose. Hide it, dodge it, survive. But something in his voice, something patient and unhurried, made her lean into the pain instead. "My husband's people were settlers. Mine were Apache. Neither side ever claimed me right. His family said I tainted him. Mine said I'd turned my back." She swallowed, hard. "When he died, his sister took the house, told me I didn't belong anywhere." Silas didn't interrupt. He just listened, still and solid. "I walked 2 days to Willow Creek," she continued. "Begged for work. They wouldn't even look me in the eye. One man called me less than dirt. Another called me worse." Silas's jaw clenched. "That town don't deserve to call itself Christian." Her voice cracked. "I used to think it was my blood, that I was wrong just by being born." He shook his head slowly. "Blood don't tell a man's story, or a woman's. The land don't care what color your skin is, just wants you to respect it and earn your keep." Nita's lip trembled. She looked down at her hands, calloused, cracked, capable. "I'm so tired of being ashamed," she whispered. He reached over then, quiet as a breath, and laid his hand over hers. It was warm, rough and unmoving. Steady. "You ain't got a single thing to be ashamed of," he said. "You held 3 boys together with nothing but grit and a piece of thread. You showed up on my land and changed it." Tears welled before she could stop them. Not from pain. She'd cried those dry. These were softer, warmer. He didn't pull his hand away. And for the first time in years, she didn't either. Under the cottonwood's shadow and the lantern's glow, Nita cried. Not from despair, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. The first snow came like a whisper, just a dusting over the prairie grass, the kind that made the world look quiet and still. But that whisper turned to a growl in the days that followed. By mid-December, the wind screamed through the cottonwoods and slammed against the barn walls like a drunk with a score to settle. The sun vanished for days at a time. The men in the bunkhouse coughed hard, deep, the kind of cough that rattled your ribs and stayed in the room long after you'd gone quiet. Nita kept the stove burning hotter, wrapped the boys in every quilt Hattie Mae could find. Still, Levi's cheeks turned ruddy with fever for 2 days straight, and Wade couldn't keep his food down. But she nursed them like a she-wolf with a litter, and by God they pulled through. It was Silas who didn't. He refused to rest, working himself to the bone hauling feed through the drifts, chopping wood until his knuckles cracked open, red against the white snow. When the ranch hands dropped one by one, Silas pushed harder. That's when she found him. It was near midnight when Nita noticed the barn lantern still lit. She threw on her shawl, teeth already chattering, and waded out through knee-deep snow. Silas was slumped beside the mare's stall, barely upright. His breath came in ragged gasps, skin glazed with sweat and pale as moon milk. "Silas," she gasped, catching him as he started to fall. He tried to wave her off, mumbling something about, "Just need a minute." but his knees buckled like dead timber. She got him to the main cabin somehow, how she'd never remember. Her shoulders screamed, her lungs burned, but she dragged him like a wounded soldier and threw open the cabin door with the force of fury and fear. Hattie Mae rushed to help. "Lord above, he's burning up." "I'll handle it," Nita snapped, her voice firm and final. She stripped him of his frozen coat and boots, laid him beneath every blanket they had. His fever was a wildfire. He thrashed in the sheets, incoherent, his body a furnace of pain and memories. For 2 days he slipped in and out of delirium. He called for his horse, for his mama, for the Lord, and once, for someone else. "Eliza," he groaned. "Don't go." Nita's hand froze on his brow. She'd heard that name once before from a gravestone on the hill behind the ranch. His wife, the woman buried with his unborn child. Nita sat back, breath caught in her throat. The wind howled like it wanted to drag her into the dark with it. But she stayed. She stayed, wiping his brow, changing the water, whispering to him, steady and warm. "You're not alone, Silas," she murmured. "You hear me? You're not alone. No more." On the 3rd day, the fever broke. It was quiet. Snow fell soft outside the frosted windows. The cabin smelled of pine and boiled herbs, and Silas opened his eyes, weak but clear. His gaze found her, and shame flickered behind it. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I thought I was talking to—" "I know who you were talking to," Nita said softly. He turned his head, staring at the ceiling. "I buried my heart with her. Swore I'd never dig it up again. Thought if I kept moving, kept my hands busy, it'd all stay buried." Nita leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought the same. About my husband. About my place in the world." Silas looked at her now, really looked. "But you pulled something out of me I didn't think was still there." She took his hand in hers, calloused to calloused. "Same here." Outside, the wind finally began to die down, and inside that little cabin with a man barely alive and a woman who had once believed she was invisible, something strong and quiet was beginning to grow. The fever might have passed, but something in Silas Reed stayed broken. He was quieter now, like the wind had scraped something off his soul while it blew through his bones. He moved slower, too, sitting more often on the porch with a blanket thrown across his lap and his gaze fixed on the distant hills, where the grave of his wife lay buried under a thick white sheet of snow. Nita saw it. She saw everything. She didn't press him, didn't poke or prod. She just kept showing up, with hot broth, with firewood, with that steady presence of hers that didn't ask for anything but gave everything. But even she couldn't deny what settled in that house now. A ghost. Not the kind that slammed doors or blew out candles. No, this ghost was quieter, meaner. It lived in glances, in silence, in the way Silas would turn away when the boys laughed too loud, or the way he'd flinch at Nita's touch like it burned. One night the wind dropped. The world was still. Nita found Silas standing at the edge of the small hill behind the ranch house, snow up to his boots, collar turned up against the cold. He didn't look back when she approached. "Didn't think anyone would follow me," he said. "You left the back door open," she replied. "I'm not letting that draft in my kitchen." He huffed a laugh, breath fogging the air. "I used to come up here every Christmas," he said, voice hoarse. "Bring her flowers, talk to her, even when the snow was knee-deep. Guess I thought maybe she was still listening." "She probably was," Nita said gently. Silas looked down. "I ain't been up here in 2 winters. Couldn't face it, couldn't face her. Not after what happened." Nita didn't ask, but he told her anyway. "She died 'cause I left her alone. Took a job breaking horses in El Paso trying to get ahead. She was 7 months along. Fell on the stairs carrying firewood. No one found her till it was too late. That baby never even cried." Silas Reed was a hard man, a cowboy, built by dust and sun and work, but his voice cracked now like old timber. "I thought maybe if I never let myself love again, I'd never have to feel that kind of pain again." Nita stepped closer, placing a mittened hand on his arm. Pain doesn't mean it wasn't worth it, she said. Love hurts. But so does being alone. Silas turned, finally facing her. His eyes were red, not from the cold. You ever wonder if we're just meant to be broken? He asked. No, she said. I think we're meant to heal, but we don't get to pick how. The wind stirred again, soft, like breath on the back of the neck. I see the way the boys look at you, he whispered. You gave them a life, a mother's love, even when you had nothing left in your own heart to give. That kind of strength scares the hell out of me. She smiled, just barely. You scared of me, Silas Reed? I'm scared of what it means if I'm not, he said. Then, slow as the sunrise, he reached out and took her hand. The snow crunched beneath them, the moon casting silver light across the ranch below, and for the first time in years, the ghost seemed to drift away. Not gone, but gentler, quieter. Back at the cabin, Wade stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about Mama's singing. Nita brushed hair from his face and kissed his brow. Silas stood in the doorway watching. When she turned, he was still there. Come inside, she said softly. You're not made of stone. He nodded, stepped forward, and the door closed behind him. The cold didn't break that morning. It sharpened. Snow still lined the rooftops and the wind cut like broken glass. But inside Silas's cabin, something had shifted. The air wasn't as heavy. The rooms didn't echo the same. There was warmth in the silence now. Not just loss, but peace. Out here never lasts long. It came with the sound of hooves. Not one rider. Several. Dust kicked up beyond the ridge. By the time Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle slung loose but ready, the riders were already halfway down the trail that curved past the cottonwoods. He didn't need a second look. Briggs, and he wasn't alone. Captain, Briggs and his lawless band weren't the kind of men who knocked. Nita came up behind him, clutching Wade and his little sister close. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but her voice was calm. How many? 5. Maybe 6, Silas muttered. All armed. Wade looked up, eyes wide. Is it the bad men, Mama? Silas glanced back at the boy, his boy now, though no one had spoken it aloud. He knelt down, brushing a hand through Wade's unkempt hair. Y'all go inside. Lock the door. Don't open it unless it's me. Nita hesitated, fierce and motherly. I'm not letting you face him alone. You ain't letting me do nothing. I already chose. She searched his face, looking for something. Fear, regret, maybe a goodbye. What she found instead was calm, unshakable. Like a man who finally knew who he was. She kissed him hard. Come back. He tipped, his hat. The riders pulled up just outside the gate. Briggs sat his horse like a king, eyes cold, the kind of cold that doesn't melt with sunlight. He wasn't a soldier anymore, hadn't been since the war left him twisted, but he still wore that damn coat like it gave him power. Silas Reed, he drawled, loud enough for the valley to hear. Heard you're keeping things that don't belong to you. Silas stood in the center of the yard, steady. Ain't nothing here belongs to you, Briggs. Briggs grinned, all snake. I ain't talking about cattle. I'm talking about that Apache boy and his sister. You know the law. Silas cocked his head. Yeah, I also know it ain't the law you follow. You're just looking to sell, them like you done the others. A murmur rippled through the riders. One of them shifted in his saddle. Briggs's grin faded. This ain't none of your business, Reed. You want to die for 2 half-breeds? Silas's voice dropped like a hammer. They're mine now. The wind stilled, then everything moved at once. A gunshot cracked. One of Briggs's men twitched wrong, raised steel too fast. Silas fired first, clean, dropped him from the saddle. Chaos exploded, but Silas was born for chaos. The fight was fast and brutal. Snow churned red where horses reared. Briggs tried to flank, but Silas met him with fire, rifle barrel swinging like a judgment. When the dust cleared, 3 riders lay dead. One crawled off bleeding. Another ran. Briggs? He was on his knees, hat lost, mouth bleeding. Silas walked up, slow, boots crunching through the mess. "You could have walked away," he said, "but you came looking for blood." Briggs spat at his feet. "This ain't over." "No," Silas said, raising the rifle. "It's just the end of you." The shot echoed like thunder. Back at the cabin, Nita opened the door to see Silas coming up the path. Limps in his walk, smoke in his clothes. But his eyes were alive. Wade ran to him first. "Did you stop the bad men?" Silas nodded, scooping him up. "Ain't nobody taking you away." Then he looked at Nita. "I chose my family today," he said, voice hoarse. "If you'll have me." She smiled through tears. "Took you long enough." And for the first time since winter started, it felt like spring might come after all. The sun rose slow that morning, casting gold across the frost-covered plains. Silas stood by the fence he built with his own hands, watching Wade chase his little sister through the open yard. Laughter rang through the cold like the jingle of wind chimes. It didn't belong to sorrow anymore. It belonged to a future, one he never thought he'd have. Behind him, Nita came out with a pot of coffee, steam curling into the crisp air. She wore Silas's old flannel draped over her shoulders, sleeves rolled up like she'd always lived here. She had. In some way, she always had. "You're up early," she said, her voice warm and worn like a well-used saddle. "Didn't sleep much," Silas replied, taking the coffee with a nod. "Land's quiet after the storm. Always makes a man think." They stood there for a while, just breathing in the morning. The past few weeks had been a blur, burying the men Briggs left behind, rebuilding the chicken coop burned in the shootout, fixing the west gate. But the biggest work wasn't with tools. It was in Silas's heart. Later that day, he took Wade riding for the first time. The boy was nervous, gripping the saddle horn like it might buck him straight to the moon. But Silas rode slow, steady, his voice calm like river water. "Easy now," he said. "Horse ain't trying to throw you. You just gotta trust it." Wade looked over, brow furrowed. "What if I fall?" Silas smiled, reins loose in one hand. "Then I'll catch you." It wasn't about horses. It was about life. And Wade understood. When they came back, Nita had supper on the fire and music playing soft on the old radio Silas kept for weather reports. It played something Spanish this time, something with soul and desert dust in its bones. Silas didn't understand the words, but he felt every note. That night, they sat out under the stars. The sky was huge out there. No towns, no noise. Just the hum of crickets and the crack of the fire. Wade curled up against Silas's side, already half asleep, and his sister lay curled in Nita's lap. Silas looked out into the dark horizon and said, "Never figured I'd be anyone's father." Nita glanced over, eyes catching firelight. "You didn't have to be. You chose to be." He nodded. "Ain't the same as blood, but it feels heavier." "Sometimes the family we choose," she said softly, "is the one worth bleeding for." He didn't answer, just stared into the flames. The next morning, Silas carved something into the oak post out front, not for him, for them. He etched 3 names, Wade, Lita, Nita, and beneath them, in steady block letters, "This land is theirs." This piece is earned. He didn't need to be remembered, just needed them to keep going. He hung his rifle on the wall that afternoon, locked it up like a memory, then walked into town for the first time in years, hat low, boots worn, but back. Straight, folks looked. Some nodded. Some crossed the street. He didn't care. He wasn't that man anymore. He bought nails, flour, a new pair of shoes for Wade, and he stopped by the schoolhouse too. "I'd like to enroll my son," he told the teacher, voice gruff but proud. Name's Wade. The last scene of the day unfolded at the porch swing. Sunset burned gold across the valley, painting their cabin in warmth. Wade was drawing something in charcoal on paper scraps. His sister held a dandelion to the wind. Nita brushed her hair slow, eyes watching Silas like she still didn't believe this was real. He looked at them all, these pieces of a life he never meant to find, and he whispered, like a prayer to the wind, "This is my home, my family, my redemption." Not loud, not dramatic, just true. Final question to the audience. In a world where the past leaves scars and the future asks for courage, would you choose to protect someone else's child as your own, even if it meant risking everything you are? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story stirred something in your soul, don't write off just yet. Subscribe now to join us for more tales of love, grit, and second chances across the Wild West. Until the next fires, ride safe, partner.